Hello, welcome to our channel. Today we have an inspiring story full of life lessons to share. If you enjoy meaningful content, leave a like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion means a lot to us. Let's get started with this touching narrative.
Margo Oliveira's mansion stood tall and formidable in the heart of the American countryside, nestled away from the prying eyes of the world. Her sprawling estate, encircled by high stone walls and a wrought iron gate, was both a sanctuary and a prison. For years, it had been the silent witness to a life in turmoil, a life that had once been vibrant and full of love, now buried under the weight of loss and grief. The once grand halls, echoing with laughter and music, were now lifeless, as though the walls themselves mourned the absence of joy. Inside, it was always quiet. Too quiet. The only sound that ever broke the silence was the rhythmic ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Margo had become used to that sound, the slow and steady pulse of time moving on, reminding her of all that was lost and all that she could never reclaim. The mansion, with all its luxurious grandeur, had become a cold and empty shell, as barren and desolate as the heart that beat within her chest. At 52, Margo was a woman who commanded respect. With her dark, perfectly styled hair, always tied back in an impeccable bun, and her striking blue eyes, once full of life, now shrouded in a veil of sorrow, she was the embodiment of power. She had built her fortune from the ground up, inheriting the vast business empire from her late husband, and over the years, she had expanded it with a sharp mind and an iron will. But despite all her success, Margo was isolated. The tragedy that had struck her family 20 years ago had changed her forever, and since then, she had chosen to shut herself off from the world. Her empire, her wealth, her status, they were all that remained in the aftermath of her greatest loss, the disappearance of her daughter, Beatriz. Beatriz had been only 12 years old when she vanished without a trace. One moment, she was there, full of life, her bright eyes sparkling with mischief and curiosity. The next, she was gone, leaving only an empty bedroom and a mother who was left to pick up the shattered pieces of her heart. The police had searched, the media had speculated, but in the end, nothing was ever found. Beatriz was simply gone, and Margo had been left alone, consumed by grief, with only the echoes of her daughter's laughter haunting the mansion's empty halls. As the years passed, Margo buried herself in her work. She threw herself into the business, becoming a force to be reckoned with in the corporate world, but the pain never fully left her. Every corner of the house held a memory, every room a reminder of the life that had once been. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape the ache in her chest, the gnawing emptiness that consumed her every waking moment. But that afternoon, as she sat alone in her office, surrounded by piles of reports and contracts, she thought, just for a fleeting moment, that perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally managed to silence the pain. It was almost as if the clock itself had conspired to keep time at bay, to help her forget. Margo glanced at the wall where the ancient timepiece ticked with its usual rhythm, but her attention was quickly diverted. A sound. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The delicate, melodic notes of a piano, playing a song that had not touched her ears in years. Her heart skipped a beat. Margo's breath caught in her throat. That music, it couldn't be. She'd heard it so many times, but that was before. Before the world fell apart. Before Beatriz had been ripped from her life. She strained her ears, trying to convince herself that it was nothing more than a figment of her imagination, a trick of the mind. But no. The music continued, growing clearer, more defined, like the whisper of a memory she couldn't outrun. She stood up abruptly, knocking a stack of papers to the floor as she crossed the room in a daze. The house, so vast and silent, seemed to reverberate with the sound of the piano. It was unmistakable. That tune. The one Beatriz had played so often. The one Margo had tried to forget but could never quite erase. It was their song, a piece that only the two of them knew. A secret melody, a bond between mother and daughter that no one else understood. Margo's heart raced in her chest as she made her way through the darkened halls of the mansion, her footsteps echoing off the polished marble floors. She moved with a sense of urgency, her eyes darting from side to side, as if expecting the walls themselves to reveal the truth. Her breath came in shallow gasps, a mixture of fear and hope twisting inside her. The sound grew louder as she approached the main living room. It was coming from there, the grand piano that had once belonged to her husband, a gift from years ago, now sitting dormant in the corner of the room. The sight of it, once a symbol of their shared love for music, now felt foreign to her. But the music, she could still hear it, clear as day. The same haunting melody that Beatriz had played before everything fell apart. Margo reached the doorway and stopped in her tracks. Her eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. There, sitting at the piano, was Maria, the housekeeper. The woman who had been with the family for years, who had seen both the joy and the sorrow that had taken root in this house. Maria was a quiet, reserved woman, who preferred the company of her chores to the bustling world outside. Margo had never expected her to be the one playing the piano. Maria's fingers danced across the keys with surprising skill, her movements fluid and practiced, as though she had been playing this very song for years. Margo stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the scene before her. How was this possible? Maria had never shown an interest in music. She had never once mentioned a connection to Beatriz, let alone to that particular song. Margo's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Maria," she called, her voice trembling. The housekeeper paused, her hands halting mid-chord. She turned to face Margo, her expression one of mild surprise, as if she had not expected to be interrupted. "Oh, Dona Margo," Maria said softly, a small, apologetic smile forming on her lips. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I was just—" "How do you know that song?" Margo demanded, her voice tightening with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. That's the song Beatriz used to play. How do you know it?" Maria blinked, clearly taken aback by Margo's sudden intensity. I'm sorry, Dona Margo. I didn't realize. It's just, I've always loved that song. I heard it long ago, when I was much younger, from a woman who came here once. She said it was special. She said it was your daughter's favorite. And ever since, whenever I could, I've played it. It makes me feel close to her somehow. Margo's breath caught in her throat. A woman. Who was this woman, and what did she know about Beatriz? Had someone known more about her daughter's life than Margo herself? The questions swirled in her mind, and she felt the ground beneath her feet shift. Who was this woman, Maria? Margo asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. What did she say about Beatriz? Maria lowered her gaze, a faint sadness clouding her features. She never gave me her name, Dona Margo. But she said she had known your daughter, and that she would always remember her. She said she had to leave quickly, but before she left, she gave me a few things. Some letters. A picture. And she told me to keep playing this song, so that no one would forget. Margo's heart skipped a beat. There was more to this story. Much more. The music was not just a memory of her daughter. It was a message, a clue, something that had been hidden from her all these years. She had thought she knew everything, but now she realized she had barely scratched the surface. The silence in the room grew heavy, but Margo could no longer ignore the call to action. She had to know more. She had to uncover the truth. With one last lingering look at Maria, Margo turned and walked out of the room. The melody of Beatriz's song echoed in her ears, growing fainter as she distanced herself from the piano, but the questions it raised only grew louder in her mind. She had spent 20 years searching for answers. But now, it seemed, the answers were finally within reach. And nothing, not time, not grief, would stop her from finding the truth. The air in the mansion felt different now. The oppressive silence, which had become a familiar companion in the years since Beatriz disappeared, seemed to have thickened, pressing down on Margo as she walked through the hallway. Her mind was swirling, caught in a cyclone of emotions and questions. Who was this woman Maria spoke of? What did she know about Beatriz? How had she learned that song, and why had she kept it a secret for so long? Margo had never been one to entertain mysteries. She was a woman of facts, of logic and reason. Her empire had been built on sharp intellect and calculated decisions, not on hunches or half-formed ideas. But the discovery of Maria's connection to Beatriz's song had shaken her to her core. The quiet, humble maid, someone she had known for years, had just revealed that she knew things about her daughter, that Margo herself had never known. The thought of it gnawed at her, pulling her back to that moment in the living room, when she stood frozen, staring at Maria's hands moving effortlessly over the piano keys. Margo made her way to the kitchen, where she had asked Maria to meet her. Her heart was heavy with the weight of the unknown, and she was determined to find out everything the maid knew. There was no time to waste, no more room for half-answers. She needed the truth, and if Maria held any piece of it, Margo would extract it. The kitchen was vast, as was everything in the mansion. It had once been a place where the family gathered, where meals were prepared and shared. But now, it felt as empty as the rest of the house, save for the soft hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. The room was dimly lit by the fading afternoon sun, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. Maria stood near the island, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she turned to face Margo. "Maria," Margo said, her voice steady but laced with an underlying edge. "We need to talk." The maid's eyes flickered with a mix of apprehension and confusion, but she nodded, gesturing for Margo to sit at the kitchen table. Margo's steps were measured as she took a seat across from Maria. Her mind was racing, but she forced herself to focus. This was not the time for emotions. It was the time for answers. "Maria," Margo began again, her voice firm now, "tell me everything. Who was the woman who gave you that song? Where did she come from, and why did she leave?" Maria hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. She had always been a quiet woman, preferring to keep to herself. But the intensity in Margo's eyes made it clear that there would be no escaping the truth this time. "Her name." Maria's voice trailed off, and she seemed to struggle for a moment, as though the memory was a painful one. "She never told me her full name. She was a stranger to this town, and when she arrived here, she was lost. I helped her. She seemed to know a lot about the family, about you, Dona Margo, and your daughter. But there was something about her. Something I couldn't place. She always seemed on edge, like she was hiding from something." Margo leaned forward, her heart beating faster now. "What do you mean, hiding from something? Did she say anything else? Anything that could explain why she knew so much about Beatriz?" Maria nodded slowly, her eyes clouded with the weight of the memory. "She told me that Beatriz was special, that she had a gift. She said that your daughter's disappearance wasn't an accident. It wasn't just some random act, like the police thought. She said someone had taken Beatriz, but not in the way we all thought. That someone powerful, wanted your daughter for reasons no one could understand." Margo's breath caught in her throat. "Taken." The word echoed in her mind, a painful reminder of the night she had lost everything. The police had been so quick to dismiss her theories, to write Beatriz's disappearance off as another missing child case. But hearing it from Maria, hearing it from someone who had never been involved in the investigation, was like a punch to the gut. She had never allowed herself to believe that Beatriz's disappearance had been anything but a random tragedy. But Maria's words made her question everything. "What else did she say, Maria?" Margo asked, her voice trembling now, despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Did she tell you who took Beatriz? Did she say anything about where she might be?" Maria shook her head slowly, a sad look in her eyes. "No, Dona Margo. She never said who took your daughter. She just warned me to be careful, to stay away from certain people. She said that there were forces at work, forces much larger than anything we could understand. I didn't know what she meant then, but now I wonder if she was trying to protect me, trying to protect all of us." Margo sat back in her chair, her mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but they didn't form a picture she could comprehend. She had always believed that the loss of Beatriz was a cruel twist of fate, a tragic, random event. But now, with Maria's words ringing in her ears, Margo was forced to confront a terrifying possibility. What if it wasn't a random act? What if there was a reason, a purpose, behind Beatriz's disappearance? Did this woman leave anything behind? A name? A place? Anything that could help us find her? Margo's voice was sharp, desperate. Maria hesitated, and for a moment, it seemed like she might not answer. But then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, faded envelope. She placed it on the table in front of Margo. "This is all I have left, Maria said quietly. "She gave me this before she left. She said it was for you, in case you ever needed it." Margot's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope. It was old, its edges frayed, and it smelled faintly of something she couldn't quite place. She opened it slowly, revealing a single piece of paper inside. It was a photograph, black and white, showing a woman standing in front of an old, crumbling building. There was something strange about the photo, something unsettling. The woman's face was obscured by shadows, but there was something about the way she stood, the way she looked at the camera, that made Margot's skin crawl. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, were two words, "Find me." Margot's heart raced as she turned the photo over. She studied it, her eyes scanning every detail. The building in the background was unfamiliar to her, its architecture strange and worn. It looked like something from another time, another world. She had no idea where it was, or who the woman in the photo might be. But one thing was certain. This woman, this stranger who had come into her life so many years ago, had known something. She had known about Beatriz, and she had known about the danger that surrounded her. "Maria," Margot said, her voice cold with resolve, "we need to find this woman. We need to know everything she knew. I don't care how long it takes. I will find out the truth about what happened to my daughter." Maria nodded, her face filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'll help you, Dona Margo. I'll do whatever it takes. But be careful. There are people out there who don't want the truth to come out." Margot stood up, clutching the photograph in her hand, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. The mystery of Beatriz's disappearance had just deepened, and now Margot knew, without a doubt, that she was on the cusp of uncovering something far darker and more complex than she could have ever imagined. As she walked out of the kitchen, the weight of the unknown pressing heavily on her shoulders, Margot felt a fire reignite within her. For the first time in 20 years, she felt something other than grief and loss. She felt hope. The hope that she might finally find her daughter. The mansion, once a symbol of luxury and success, now felt more like a cage, its walls pressing in on Margot with an ever-growing sense of urgency. She had spent 20 long years trapped in her own sorrow, but now, for the first time, that sorrow was joined by something else, something powerful and relentless. It was the pull of a mother's instinct, the gnawing need to know the truth, to uncover the mystery that had haunted her every waking moment since Beatriz disappeared. The photograph Maria had given her still clutched tightly in her hand. It was all she had, this faded picture, a shadowed woman, and the cryptic words written on the back, "Find me." For the first time in 2 decades, Margot felt a spark of hope. The woman in the photo, the one who had known Beatriz, was the key. She knew something. She held the answers Margot had spent years searching for. And now, that search would finally begin. But where to start? The woman in the photograph. Who was she? And where was this building in the background? It was an old, crumbling structure, almost like a forgotten relic from another time. Margot had never seen anything like it before, and yet, a strange sense of recognition tugged at her. The architecture seemed familiar, but she couldn't place it. Was it from this town? From another state? A memory buried deep within her subconscious began to stir, but it remained just out of reach. Margot had no intention of wasting any more time. She couldn't afford to. Her daughter had been missing for 20 years, and every second mattered. She had to follow the trail, no matter where it led. As she sat in her office, staring at the photograph, she felt the weight of her responsibilities pulling at her. The empire she had built, the businesses she had grown, none of it mattered now. None of it could fill the void left by Beatriz's disappearance. She had worked hard, she had excelled, and she had conquered the corporate world, but all of that seemed irrelevant. She would trade it all, in an instant, to have her daughter back. Her eyes wandered to the desk, cluttered with documents and reports, but they held no interest for her. The future of her empire no longer felt important. Not today. Today, she had a singular focus, finding Beatriz. And she would stop at nothing to do so. She rose from her chair, pacing the room, her mind spinning with possibilities. Find me. Those words echoed in her head. Someone had left her a clue, but who? And why? The mystery was deeper than she could have ever imagined. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Margo turned to find Maria standing in the doorway, her expression cautious. Margo's eyes narrowed as she gestured for the maid to enter. "Yes, Maria?" Margo asked, her voice steady but tinged with the urgency of the moment. Maria stepped into the room slowly, her hands wringing the dish towel nervously. "Dona Margo," she began, her voice soft. "I've been thinking about what we discussed. The woman, the photograph. There's something I didn't mention earlier." Margo's heart skipped a beat. "What is it, Maria? What did you leave out?" Maria hesitated before speaking, her eyes darting to the floor as if she were reluctant to share something so important. Finally, she met Margo's gaze. "The woman who gave me the photograph, she was afraid. Not just of the people who were after her, but of something bigger. Something I couldn't quite understand at the time. She said that if you were ever going to find out the truth, you would have to be prepared. Prepared for what, I don't know. But she made me promise to give you a warning. That the search wouldn't be easy. That you'd uncover things you weren't meant to know." Margo's stomach tightened. "What kind of things?" she asked, her voice hard. What was she talking about? Maria shook her head slowly, as though the memory was still too painful to relive. "She didn't say. She just told me that Beatriz wasn't just any child. That there were people who wanted her for a reason. She told me that she had seen things. Things that would put you in danger if you followed this path. I didn't want to believe her at the time, but now I think she was right." Margo felt a cold chill wash over her. Danger. The word echoed in her mind, mixing with the dark thoughts that had been swirling around her for years. If there were people who wanted Beatriz for reasons beyond what she had ever imagined, if there was more to her daughter's disappearance than a random kidnapping, then what kind of forces was she really up against? What had her daughter been involved in? And why had she been taken? She looked at Maria, her expression hardening. "I don't care about danger, Maria. I don't care what I have to face. I want the truth. Whatever it is, I'll deal with it. But I need to know what happened to Beatriz." Maria nodded, her face a mixture of fear and understanding. "I'll help you, Dona Margo. Whatever it takes. I just want you to be careful. I've seen the way this world works. It's not just about money or power. There are forces out there that you don't understand." Margo's mind was already spinning with 1,000 possibilities. Forces. People. A hidden world she had never imagined. For a moment, she thought about the warning Maria had given her, and the fear that lingered in the maid's voice. But Margo shook it off. Fear had no place in this. Not now. "I'll be careful, Maria," Margo said, her voice cold and determined. "But I won't stop. I can't." She turned back to the desk, her fingers brushing over the photograph once again. "Find me." That was the only thing that mattered now. The woman in the photograph had left her a trail that she could follow. But it was going to be dangerous. Margo knew that much. The deeper she dug, the more perilous it would become. But she was prepared for that. She had no choice. Margo's gaze shifted to the map of the United States on the wall, dotted with pins marking various locations. Her empire spanned across the country, but that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the mystery in that photo. She had no idea where this building was, but she would find out. She would follow every lead, every tiny clue, until she uncovered the truth. She turned to Maria, her mind already set. "I need you to find out everything you can about this building," she said, pointing to the photo. "Where it is, what it is, and who might have known about it." Maria nodded quickly. "Yes, Dona Margo. I'll do that right away." "Good," Margo said, her voice filled with resolve. "We don't have time to waste." As Maria left the room, Margo took a deep breath and sat back in her chair. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. She was no longer the woman who had been paralyzed by grief. She was a mother on a mission. And no matter what it took, she would find Beatriz. She had to. Later that evening, Margo sat alone in her study, the photograph of the woman still in her hands. The room was lit only by the soft glow of the desk lamp, casting long shadows across the walls. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of possibilities and fears. The woman in the photo, the strange building, the cryptic warning, everything felt so surreal, as if she were stepping into a world that had been hidden from her all these years. Her fingers gripped the edges of the photo tightly. "Find me." The words were a lifeline, a thread pulling her through the darkness. Margo had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in 2 decades, she felt a fire burning inside her, a fire that she hadn't felt in years. The hunt for Beatriz had begun, and there was no turning back. The mansion, once a grand symbol of wealth and status, now felt like an arena for a battle, its walls enclosing Margo in a space where time itself seemed to stand still. The weight of the investigation loomed over her like a storm cloud, its dark, oppressive presence consuming her every thought. She could no longer afford to linger in the memories of the past. What mattered now was finding Beatriz, uncovering the truth that had eluded her for 20 long years. The photograph Maria had handed her still sat on her desk, its faded edges and shadowed figures haunting her as she stared at it, her mind working overtime to make sense of the mystery it presented. The building in the background of the photo, how was it connected to Beatriz? And what had the woman in the picture known about her daughter? The question gnawed at Margo, a constant reminder that the answers she sought were somewhere out there, buried beneath layers of secrets and lies. That evening, as the darkness crept in around the mansion, Margo knew the time had come to take action. There was no more room for hesitation. She had to act now, and she would stop at nothing to find the answers she so desperately needed. Margo stood in front of her expansive wall of maps, each pin representing a place, a lead, a possibility. Her fingers traced over the edges of each map as she tried to draw connections between the places she had visited in the past and the mysterious building in the photo. But nothing made sense. Nothing fit. The woman in the photo, the cryptic warning, and the strange words "find me" echoed in her mind, but the puzzle remained unsolved. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Margo turned, expecting Maria, but to her surprise, it was Ethan, her trusted assistant, the one person who had been with her through the toughest years of her life. Ethan had been with her since the early days, helping her manage her business empire, and more than that, he had always been a quiet, reliable presence when her life had seemed like a never-ending whirlwind of corporate decisions. Ethan was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was always with purpose. Margo had never considered him anything more than a colleague, but his loyalty and competence had earned him her respect. Now, as he stood in the doorway, his eyes serious and focused, she could tell that something had changed. "Something on your mind, Ethan?" she asked, trying to keep the urgency in her voice at bay. Ethan stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "I've been looking into the woman in the photograph," he said, his voice calm but his tone carrying a weight of concern. "I couldn't find much on her, but I did find something. Something that might be connected to her." Margo felt a chill run down her spine. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, as though he wasn't sure how much to reveal. But finally, he pulled a small folder from his briefcase and placed it on the desk in front of her. "I found a name. A name that matches the description of the woman who gave Maria the photograph." Margo opened the folder with trembling hands, the anticipation building in her chest. Inside, there was a photograph of a woman, her face half hidden in shadow, just like the one in the photo Maria had given her. The resemblance was uncanny, but it was the name beneath the photo that sent a shockwave through Margo's system. Serafina Blackwood. The name burned itself into Margo's brain, and for a moment, her vision blurred as her heart hammered in her chest. Serafina Blackwood. She had heard the name before, but it didn't make sense. Blackwood was a name from another life, a name that Margo had thought had faded into the shadows of time. She had been a prominent figure in the circles Margo used to run in, before the years of isolation and grief had cut Margo off from the rest of the world. Serafina Blackwood had once been part of the elite, a socialite who moved in the same high-powered circles Margo had. But she had disappeared without a trace, as if the world had swallowed her whole. Margo's mind raced. Serafina Blackwood? Could it be the same woman who had given Maria the photograph? Could she have known something critical about Beatriz? Margo looked up at Ethan, her voice tight with disbelief. "Are you sure it's her?" Ethan nodded. "It matches, Dona Margo. I did some digging. The name, the face, it all lines up. But it doesn't stop there. I found something else that might be more significant. Margo leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. What else? Ethan opened the folder further, revealing a series of documents. According to records I found from an old charity event hosted by the Blackwood family, Serafina Blackwood was involved with a number of powerful people. The connections she had, they're not the kind of people anyone would want to get involved with. It looks like she was a key player in some very influential circles. And these circles were connected to a lot of secretive operations. People who dealt in things that were not legal, to say the least. Margo felt the air in the room grow thick with tension. She had known that the disappearance of Beatriz had been shrouded in mystery, but now it seemed like there was a much darker force at play. The name Blackwood had once been associated with wealth, privilege, and high society, but now it was tied to something far more sinister. Serafina Blackwood, Margo repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. She was involved in something dangerous. Ethan nodded. It appears so. And if she's the same woman who left the photograph for Maria, then she had knowledge of something bigger than any of us could have imagined. Something connected to your daughter. Margo slammed her hand down on the desk, frustration surging through her. What do you mean, Ethan? What is all this? And how does it connect to Beatriz? Ethan's eyes darkened. That's the part that doesn't make sense yet. But I believe that Serafina Blackwood knew exactly what was happening to your daughter. And she was trying to warn you. She knew something about Beatriz, something that could explain her disappearance, and the powerful people behind it. Margo took a deep breath, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. Serafina Blackwood was no longer just a name from the past. She was a key to everything. If Margo could find her, if she could unravel the truth about who Serafina had been involved with, then maybe, just maybe, she could finally get the answers she had been seeking for so long. But as Margo looked down at the photograph of Serafina Blackwood, she knew one thing for certain. Finding Serafina would not be easy. In fact, it would be dangerous. Serafina had disappeared years ago, and it was clear that the people she had been connected to would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. I need to find her, Margo said, her voice now steady and determined. I need to find Serafina Blackwood. And I need to understand exactly what she knew about my daughter. Ethan nodded gravely. I'll help you in any way I can, Dona Margo. But you should be prepared for what lies ahead. This goes deeper than we ever imagined. Margo's gaze shifted to the map on the wall once more, her mind racing. The search had just begun, but the stakes had never been higher. Whatever Serafina Blackwood had known, Margo was about to find out. And when she did, nothing would ever be the same again. Her daughter's disappearance was no longer just a tragic event. It was a puzzle, a mystery that went far beyond her understanding. But Margo was no longer afraid. She was ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. The truth was out there, and she was going to uncover it, no matter the cost. The mansion had never felt colder. The once comforting embrace of its vast, empty halls now felt like a labyrinth of forgotten memories, each turn pulling Margo deeper into the shadow of the unknown. The weight of her mission, the truth about Beatriz, the cryptic message from Serafina Blackwood, the tangled web of secrecy, pressed down on her chest with a relentless force. Every inch of the grand estate, every polished surface, now seemed a reminder of what she had lost, what she had failed to protect. The walls around her seemed to echo her thoughts, amplifying her fears. Margo's grip on the cold metal of the stair banister tightened as she ascended to the second floor, the familiar groan of the wooden steps beneath her feet the only sound in the otherwise silent mansion. But there was something else now, something that stung her as she moved through the rooms. The mansion had always been a fortress, a monument to her strength and success, but today it felt like a prison, an inescapable cage. In the study, she had been poring over the research that Ethan had provided. Serafina Blackwood's name had surfaced over and over again, tied to whispers of corruption, dark money, and shadowy figures that danced just beyond the reach of the law. The deeper Margo dug, the darker the path became. There were reports of mysterious disappearances, black market deals, and illegal operations that stretched across countries. Yet, despite all the hints, the answers were elusive. It was as if Serafina Blackwood had lived a life shrouded in secrecy, only leaving behind vague traces and cryptic clues. But the most chilling discovery of all was that there had been no confirmed trace of Serafina since the day she had vanished from the public eye, 20 years ago. Margot's pulse quickened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The woman who had left her the photograph, the woman who had seemed so desperate to pass on a warning, had disappeared into thin air. The connections she had made, the people she had known, were the types of individuals Margot had hoped never to confront. She was dealing with a world she had been blissfully ignorant of for years, until now. But the question burned in her mind: what was Serafina's role in all this? How was she connected to Beatriz? It was early evening when Margot received the call from Ethan. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was tight, filled with urgency. "Donna Margot, I think I've found something," Ethan said. "Something that might help us figure out where Serafina is, and more importantly, how this all ties back to your daughter." Margot's heart began to race. "What have you found?" "There's a place," Ethan continued, his words measured and cautious. "It's not far from here. A safe house, of sorts, owned by an anonymous figure tied to some of the people Serafina was close to. From what I've gathered, it's been used by people who want to hide from the world. And I believe Serafina may have hidden something there. Maybe even something to do with Beatriz." Margot's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. A hidden location? A safe house? Could this be the break she'd been waiting for? "I'll go," she said immediately, before her mind could talk her out of it. "Where is it?" "It's not far," Ethan replied. "But it's not going to be easy to get in. Whoever owns it has gone to great lengths to cover its tracks." Margot's jaw clenched. "I don't care how difficult it is. I'm going." She hung up, her decision final. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to align, but now it was time to step into the unknown, into the very heart of the darkness that had consumed her for so long. Within the hour, Margot was in her car, the engine humming steadily as she sped down the long, winding roads that led her away from the mansion. The town she lived in had always been peaceful, almost too quiet, until now. Margot's thoughts kept returning to the photo, the woman in the photograph, and the cryptic message, "Find me." There was no turning back now. She had crossed a threshold. And the only thing that mattered was finding the truth. As the car cut through the fog, the landscape around her seemed to shift. The roads grew narrower, the trees denser. There were no streetlights here, only the dark, oppressive canopy of branches that seemed to close in on her, narrowing her path. Margot's eyes darted from side to side, searching for any sign of the safe house. The directions Ethan had given her led her to a forgotten stretch of land on the outskirts of town, a patch of forest so dense that it felt as though the world had been swallowed whole by the trees. Margot slowed the car, her headlights cutting through the thick darkness. The wind outside howled through the branches, but the silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig underfoot. As she reached the end of the road, she saw it. A dilapidated stone building, half hidden by overgrown ivy and moss, stood at the edge of the woods. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. The walls were covered in dirt and grime, windows boarded up, and the roof sagged in places. It was the kind of place that gave off an unsettling aura. And yet, as Margot stepped out of the car, her instincts screamed that this was where she needed to be. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the building, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath her feet. There was no sign of anyone. No lights in the windows, no cars parked nearby. It was as though the place had been completely abandoned, just as Ethan had suggested. She reached the front door and found it slightly ajar, as if someone had recently left in a hurry. Margot hesitated for only a moment before she pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty space within. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The room was dark, save for the faint light of the moon that filtered in through cracks in the boarded-up windows. Margot's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and she quickly surveyed the area. It was sparse, just a few old pieces of furniture covered in dust, a rotting wooden table, and a fireplace filled with ashes. But there was a heaviness in the air, an energy that seemed to vibrate beneath the surface. Margot moved forward, every instinct telling her that she was getting closer to something monumental, something she was not prepared to understand. Her hand reached for the edges of a nearby bookshelf, but before she could take another step, a sound stopped her in her tracks. A door creaked open, a low, guttural noise that seemed to reverberate through the empty house. Margo froze, her breath caught in her throat. Someone else was here. And this time, she wasn't alone. Margo's breath hitched in her chest as the sound of the door creaking open reverberated through the otherwise silent house. Her heart raced, the heavy thud of it echoing in her ears as she froze, every muscle in her body tensed with the realization that this moment would define everything. The shadows in the room seemed to close in around her, and for the first time in years, she felt vulnerable, like prey trapped in a hunter's snare. She hadn't expected this. The safe house, a place thought to be abandoned, should have been a solitary space, a place where secrets were hidden, not where they came to life. Margo's eyes darted to the darkened hallway ahead, the dim light from the cracks in the boarded windows offering little illumination. The door that had creaked open just moments ago stood ajar, revealing nothing but thick shadows beyond. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Margo's hand instinctively moved to the concealed firearm hidden beneath her jacket. She was prepared for danger, but the growing sense of dread clawing at her insides told her that this situation was far more sinister than anything she had imagined. This wasn't just about finding the truth anymore, it was about survival. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to run back to the safety of the mansion, to escape whatever dark force had brought her here. But there was no going back now. Beatriz. The photograph. Serafina Blackwood. It all led to this. If she turned back now, everything would have been for nothing. Margo stepped forward cautiously, each footfall soft against the floor, her breath shallow. The air in the house felt thick, laden with tension. She could hear nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat, racing faster as she moved toward the hallway. Her hand reached the cold metal of the doorknob, and in a flash, she swung the door open, only to be greeted by a darkened room. A small, windowless space that seemed to hum with a strange energy. It was a study, but unlike anything she had ever seen before. The walls were lined with shelves, but the books on them were yellowed and aged, their titles almost indecipherable. Dust covered the furniture, and there were odd old maps pinned up on the walls, some of which appeared to be annotated in languages Margo couldn't understand. It was then that she saw him, an old man, hunched over a desk in the far corner of the room. His back was to her, and he didn't seem to hear her approach. The faint light from a candle flickered next to him, casting long shadows across his face. His hands, bony and gnarled, shuffled through a set of old papers. Margo felt her pulse spike, an icy shiver running down her spine. Something about the man didn't sit right with her. There was an air of familiarity to him, though she couldn't place it. He was muttering to himself, his voice a low, raspy murmur that seemed to blur with the air around them. "Serafina," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. Margo's heart skipped a beat. Serafina. The name sent a shockwave through her, resonating deep within her. Could this man know something? Was he connected to the missing woman? She stepped into the room, her voice cutting through the silence. "Who are you?" The old man's head jerked up, and Margo took an instinctual step back. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his face, yet they gleamed with an unsettling clarity, as if he had been waiting for her. There was a moment of tense silence as they regarded one another, and in that moment, Margo knew she was standing at the precipice of a truth too terrible to comprehend. He grinned, a slow, knowing grin, as though the years of waiting had finally come to an end. "So you've come," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "I knew you would, Margo. I knew you would eventually find your way here." Margo swallowed, her instincts on high alert. "What do you know about Beatriz? About Serafina Blackwood?" The old man chuckled, a deep, rattling sound that reverberated in the silence of the room. "You're a determined one, aren't you? I was hoping it would be you who found me, but I didn't think you'd be so eager. It's not every day that someone comes looking for the truth when they know how dangerous it can be." Margo stepped forward, her voice firm. "Answer me. What do you know about Beatriz? Where is she?" The old man's eyes glittered with a strange mix of amusement and sorrow. "Ah, Beatriz, your daughter. She's not lost, Margo. She's right here, close to you. You've always been closer to the truth than you realized." Margo's mind spun. What did he mean by that? She thought she had uncovered every possible clue, followed every lead, but this was unlike anything she had prepared for. Beatriz is close? The old man slowly stood from his desk, his frail figure shifting in the dim light. He turned toward a large painting that hung on the far wall. Margo noticed the edges of it were worn, but the image it displayed was striking. An image of a woman elegant, with dark hair cascading down her back. It was unmistakably Serafina Blackwood. He walked toward the painting, his hands trembling as he pushed it aside, revealing a hidden door. Margo's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the secret that had been buried all these years. She took a step forward, her heart hammering in her chest, and the old man stepped aside to allow her access. "Go on, Margo," he said quietly. "The truth is waiting for you." Margo didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small but well lit, filled with old books, papers, and strange objects that seemed out of place in the desolate house. At the far end of the room, there was a large wooden chest, almost like a treasure chest, ornate with carvings, its surface covered in dust. She walked toward it slowly, her heart racing as the air around her grew heavier. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment that would finally unlock the mystery of her daughter's disappearance. Her hands shook as she knelt in front of the chest. With a deep breath, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there was nothing but a single item, a music box. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, the familiar shape of it sending a wave of recognition crashing over her. It was the music box that Beatriz had cherished as a child, a gift Margo had given her for her birthday years ago. The box was old now, its once brilliant surface dulled by time, but the key was still attached, and when Margo wound it, a soft, haunting melody filled the air. Her breath caught in her throat. The tune, the very same one that had played in the background of her life for so many years. The song she had thought lost forever. The song that had once filled her home with warmth and love. "Find me." It was then that the truth hit her, like a tidal wave crashing over her. Beatriz had never truly been lost. She had been right there, in the shadows, hidden in plain sight. The music box wasn't just an object, it was a message. A message from her daughter, from the past, reaching out to her. And then, from the corner of the room, a voice, familiar, soft, and filled with emotion. "Mom." Margo turned around, her eyes wide, and for the first time in 20 years, she saw her daughter standing there, alive and well, her eyes filled with tears. "Beatriz," Margo whispered, her voice barely a breath. The reunion was silent, filled with a depth of emotion that words could never capture. In that moment, all the years of pain, loss, and fear melted away, replaced with the overwhelming realization that the answers had always been here. In the music, in the house, and in her daughter's heart. And as the music box continued to play, Margo knew that she had found not just the truth, but the piece of her heart she had been missing all along.